Good day to you. I've had this in my office for years. Keep my tea bags in it. What is it? Do you even know? Do you know why I'm telling you about where I keep my tea bags? No, you don't, because what I just did was a good example of how not to use a visual aid or a presentation aid, if you prefer, as the book calls it, in any kind of communication, let alone a speech. So that's one of the things that I want to address in this instructor video. And if there's one thing that I want you to know by the end of this instructor video, it's I want you to know how to continue to enhance your own delivery. So that's a thesis statement that we started with during the last class, and we're continuing on now because I want you to have this information before you deliver your persuasive speeches starting after spring break. So I'm going to cover three things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be covering evidence, because we never really wrapped up how you cite evidence in a speech. So we'll be talking about that. I'll be referring to the outline that's posted online, the outline shell. So you want to have that by your side. We'll be talking about evidence first. And then after that, I'm going to talk about also working from this outline that I hope you have open. The second thing I'm going to talk about are what are known as flow comments. That's the second thing we'll be talking about in this video. And then thirdly and finally, I'm going to talk about presentation aids, and specifically how you present them. There are some steps for that. So that's the three things that you need to know before you deliver your persuasive speeches. So let's talk about evidence. I'd like to refer you to the outline shell. Have that open, please. And there's two places that we put evidence in a speech. Because when you think about it, evidence is going to be presented to back up your claims, right? And your claims are making the argument that shows up in your thesis. That's what we've been working on in the class, last couple classes. But how do you cite evidence? Where do you put it in a speech? Because in a paper, it goes at the end, right? That's where the person goes to the end. They look at references. But we're not delivering content in a paper in this class. We're delivering content by speaking to people. So we have two places that we like to place the citation of evidence. The first place is in the intro, right? And if you're taking a look at the intro right now, you can see where that's probably going to be, where the place is that you want to put evidence, right? It's going to go into the speaker qualifications. So in that area of the intro to your speech, you're doing the five things, right? You have your attention getter to start with, and you're going to your thesis statement, and then you come to qualifications. One of the qualifications, aside from anything that you personally are going to cite about yourself as a qualification, one of your qualifications is that you consulted research, and you looked at a journal article, or you interviewed a person who works in an occupation, or you read a newspaper story. Remember, there are three kinds of evidence, right? There's testimony, which is a quote or a paraphrase. And there is, secondly, statistics, numbers in essence. And then thirdly, we've got personal observation. Those are your three kinds of evidence. So where do you tell the audience where you got your evidence from? You do it first in the qualification. You just say, I read this journal article, or I spoke to so-and-so, and you mention that as part of your intro. The second place that you mention your evidence, if you scroll down and continuing to look at the outline shell, the second place that you put evidence is in those subpoints. See those subpoints for point A, point B, point 3, or 1, 2, 3, if you want to count them that way. The subpoints is where you put your evidence. So specifically, when you get to a subpoint, let's say you're making the argument about women experiencing more sexual assault than men. That's one of your claims. And you want to cite evidence. So you are going to, in your subpoint, to back that up, you're going to say, according to a study by Planned Parenthood, which was published in wherever it was published, women experience more sexual assaults than men. In fact, they are 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault than men, if that's what the number says. So your evidence is going into those subpoints, and that's where you're individually citing the source for the particular piece of evidence that you're giving. Whereas in the qualifications, you're just saying, okay, in order to prepare this speech, I have talked to these people, I have researched this, I have read this publication, I have watched this TV newscast, etc. But when you get into the subpoints, that's where you specifically tag your evidence with the source that you got it from. Okay, so that wraps up evidence, the first point. Now I'd like to move on to what are referred to as flow comments. And I don't know when you drove home over spring break what it was like for you, but could you imagine with everything else, the snow and the weather and the traffic and getting out of your dorm and everything else that goes with the hassles of driving, could you imagine if your car was stuck in one gear the whole way home, stuck in first gear, stuck in second gear, etc.? What would that be like? It would be a very jarring ride, right? You'd be going like this. It would be a very rough ride. Well, that's the same principle behind why we use flow comments in a speech, because we don't want the ride for the audience to be rough. We don't want it to be jarring. We want our audience to be able to follow along. We don't want them to get lost when we're speaking to them. We don't want them to say, why, what point is that person in? Where are they going to next? How does this make sense, what they're talking about, with what they said they're going to talk about? You don't want those questions to be raised. So we have two kinds of flow comments that we use in a speech to help the speech flow. So the first is what is known as a transition, right? And that's not a new word for you, transition. You know what a transition is when you write. You might write the word consequently or however. That's known as a transition phrase in writing. Well, we do the same thing in speech making, except what a transition does is it's supposed to tell the audience, hey, I'm leaving one point behind now and I'm going to a whole other point. I'm going to be talking now about something different. I'm moving to this second point or this third point. I'm leaving one point behind and I'm going to another point. That's what tells the audience that this is happening, a flow comment. So you will say things like, if you're looking at the outline again in front of you here, let's say that you are in the body. Okay, so look at the body right now and you are finishing up the third subpoint in your first point. You're finishing up that evidence and you're going to move on to the second point. So you want to let your audience know with a flow comment. You're going to say, that brings me to the second point, or that takes us to the second point, or now that we've talked about sexual assault, let's next talk about, and then name the next point. Those are all transitionary phrases, and there are others that you can use as well. It's basically announcing inside of the speech to the audience, hey, leaving this point behind, done with that one, going to a new point. Okay, so that's one kind of flow comment. The second kind of flow comment is what is known as a signpost. A signpost, which we've raised that term before in this class, right? We talked about a signpost as being the same thing as a preview. You're telling the audience what is coming up in the speech. Except the signpost doesn't just have to be used in the preview. The signpost being, I've got 3 points today. The first one is this, the second one is this, and the third one is this. That's a regular signpost in a preview. But you can also use a signpost when you get into the body of your speech, right? So when you talk about the first major point, you could say to the audience, I've got 3 different kinds of evidence that I'm going to go over here to show you that females experience sexual assault more than males. I've got 3 pieces of evidence. And that tells the audience, therefore, that when you're talking about the first piece, you've got 2 more to go. When you're talking about the second piece, you've got 1 more to go. When you're talking about that third piece, they know already ahead of time, because you told them how many there are, that you're going to be moving on to another point. And then comes the transition, right? So signposts and transitions, they work together. And I'm going to be listening for those in your persuasive speeches. Signposts and transitions. You can transition from the intro to the body, and you can transition from the body to the conclusion. That leaves the intro behind. Now let's go to the first point. That's a transition. This first point has 3 different subpoints to it. That's a signpost. All right, now I'd like to move on to our final main point for today, and that's how to present aids. And the problem with the aid that I tried to introduce at the beginning of class was I didn't help you understand why I was using that aid. So we want to help our audience understand why we're using aids by following 4 steps. When we use any kind of aid in a speech, a visual aid, an audio aid, an object, anything at all, we have 4 steps that we follow. The first step is to introduce the aid. Okay, so I'd like you to take a look at this can that says Heineken on it. Take a look at it. Okay, so I'm introducing the aid. I've named what it is. It's a can, okay? Same with a PowerPoint. I'd like you to take a look at this slide that I have in front of you here. Whatever you have to introduce. Don't just bring it out and start talking about it. I would like to show you what I'm holding here in my hand. It's a can. That's step number 1. Number 2 is you have to tell the audience where to look or what to listen to. I'd like you to look at the red star on this can. See that red star? That has been an icon for Heineken ever since it was founded. The red star is always used to brand Heineken beer. So you know where to look, right? You're not looking down here at the H. Your eyes are not searching all over wondering, what am I supposed to look at? And then you're losing what I'm saying to you because I've already told you where to look. So step number 1 is introduce the aid. Hey, I've got a can here. It's a tin can. It has Heineken on it. Number 2 is to tell people where to look. Take a look at the red star. And then number 3, which I already kind of just did, is to interpret the presentation aid for the audience. And I interpreted that star by saying it's been with Heineken since it was founded. Now, the red star, you may think, that may have other meanings. It could sound like communism, right? Red and the star, sometimes that's used to communicate communism, but not in this case. So I'm interpreting this thing that I'm holding in my hands, and you need to interpret for your audience whatever the aid is that you're using to support your speech. Step number 4 is optional. It depends on the aid, and it is to put it away, right? To put it away if it's going to be a distraction for the rest of the speech. You have a really incredible photograph up. Is that something that's going to take people away from your speech, the rest of your speech as you're speaking, because they're focused on that really interesting photograph? Or is that photograph speaking to the whole entire speech with a kind of tone? Or is it speaking to the entire speech with a kind of imagery that you want to get across? Therefore, it's appropriate to leave that aid up for the rest of the speech. That's a call that you have to make. Essentially, you want to take away that aid if it's going to disrupt and distract away from the rest of the speech. So there you have it. That wraps up the 3 things that I wanted to talk about today. The first being evidence, the second being flow comments, and the third being how to use your presentation aids. I do hope you know how to better enhance your delivery, especially as it's coming up in these persuasive speeches. And as you head into spring break, I hope you now have the confidence to come back and deliver a bang-up persuasive speech. Have a great day.